The soft hum of a ceiling fan filled the quiet room. Michael sat at his desk, browsing through photos of last year's trip with his wife, Emily. Everything seemed perfect back then, or at least that's what he had convinced himself. Lately, though, Emily had been acting distant late-night meetings, hushed phone calls, a noticeable lack of affection. Michael's instincts told him something wasn't right. One evening, Michael decided to come home early from work, hoping to surprise Emily with her favorite takeout. As he stepped into the apartment, the unfamiliar scent of cologne hit him. His heart raced. He moved silently through the hallway, his pulse pounding in his ears. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and voices whispered from inside. Carefully, he peeked through the crack. There she was, Emily, sitting on the edge of the bed, laughing softly with another man. His hand rested on her knee, his thumb gently brushing her skin. Michael felt the ground beneath him give way. He couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the man leaned in, kissed Emily on the lips, and whispered something that made her smile. Michael's vision blurred with rage, but instead of barging in, he backed away. Confrontation wouldn't solve anything now. He needed to know more. That night, Michael barely slept. His mind replayed the scene over and over again, each time more painful than the last. By morning, he had made up his mind. He would follow her, gather proof, and only then confront her. Over the next few days, Michael hired a private investigator. It didn't take long for the truth to unfold. Emily had been seeing this man David for months. Romantic dinners, weekend getaways, stolen moments while Michael was at work. The evidence was undeniable. A week later, Michael received a call from the investigator. David is planning to meet Emily tonight at their usual spot. The investigator informed him. The rooftop restaurant downtown. Are you ready to confront them? Michael's hands shook as he hung up the phone. Was he ready? His heart said no, but his mind screamed yes. He had to know why she had done this to him, why she had destroyed the life they built together. That evening, Michael dressed in his finest suit, straightened his tie, and made his way to the rooftop restaurant. As he entered, his eyes scanned the room until they landed on them, Emily and David, seated by the window, laughing, sipping wine like they didn't have a care in the world. His blood boiled. Without hesitation, Michael walked over, his shadow falling over their table. Emily's laughter died the moment she looked up and saw him. Her face paled. Michael, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. David looked confused, but Michael wasn't here for him. He stared at Emily, his eyes burning with betrayal. I know everything, he said, his voice low and trembling with barely controlled anger. Emily's eyes welled up with tears, but Michael didn't stop. All the lies, the secrets, the meetings. How long did you think you could keep this up? I'm sorry, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. I never meant for this to happen. Michael laughed bitterly. Sorry, that's all you have to say. His heart ached, but beneath the pain, there was a strange sense of relief. The truth was out. Emily looked down, tears spilling down her cheeks. It was a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was lost, confused. I never wanted to lose you. Michael's anger simmered. But you did, Emily. You lost me the moment you chose him. The silence between them was suffocating. David stood up, muttering something about leaving, but Michael didn't care. His eyes remained locked on Emily's tear-streaked face. I loved you, Michael said, his voice softer now, filled with sorrow. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away. I'll never understand why. Emily sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Please, don't leave me. We can fix this. I'll do anything. Michael, anything. Michael shook his head, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. Some things can't be fixed, Emily. With one last look, he turned and walked away, leaving her sobbing at the table. Each step he took felt like a knife twisting in his chest, but deep down, he knew it was the right choice. He had loved her with everything he had, but now, It was time to love himself enough to let go. Eric had never imagined that silence could be so loud. It was 2:15 a.m. when he opened the front door of his home. After a grueling 18-hour shift in the trauma unit, all he wanted was to surprise Samantha. He held a bouquet of lilies, her favorite, and a box of decadent tiramisu, the dessert they had shared on the day they first met 4 years ago. The house was unusually still. As Eric stepped inside, he noticed something strange. Samantha hadn't left a light on for him like she usually did when he came home late. The soft glow that would usually greet him at the door was missing, and the air felt thick, like a secret hanging in the room, waiting to be uncovered. He tiptoed upstairs, the quiet growing more unsettling with each step. His heart, once filled with excitement, now raced with an unshakable sense of dread. Why was the house so quiet? Why was the bedroom door slightly ajar? Eric pushed the door open slowly, his breath catching in his throat. At first, his eyes couldn't make sense of the scene before him. Samantha, tangled in the sheets with someone else. A man he recognized immediately. It was her friend's boyfriend. For a moment, Eric's mind went blank, and the world stopped spinning. The bouquet slipped from his hand, the flowers falling silently to the floor. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the rational part of his brain. His legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot. Samantha stirred, half awake, but the man beside her remained oblivious. She opened her eyes, and when she saw Eric standing there exhausted, confused, and utterly heartbroken, a flicker of shock crossed her face. But she didn't say a word. Eric didn't speak either. His mouth was dry, his thoughts a jumbled mess. What could he even say? Every word felt meaningless in the face of what he had just witnessed. His mind screamed at him to confront her, to demand answers, but his body refused to cooperate. Instead, he turned around and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but inside, Eric's world had just imploded. The parking lot was deserted when Eric returned to the hospital. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. It was 4 a.m., and the trauma surgeon, who could keep his cool under the most intense situations, was now breaking down, tears streaming down his face. He cried like a child, uncontrollable sobs racking his body. It was the kind of crying that comes from the deepest part of your soul, the kind that makes you feel like you might never stop. He didn't have his phone with him, didn't even think to grab it when he stormed out of the house. He was alone in the dark, consumed by betrayal, disbelief, and a heartache so deep it felt like it might swallow him whole. The hospital, a place where he had saved countless lives, now felt like a prison. A place where he couldn't escape his thoughts. Eric sat there, motionless, staring out into the night. His life, once built on trust and love, had been obliterated in an instant. His colleagues, concerned after seeing him in such a state, eventually found him in the parking lot. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. They called his father, and it wasn't long before his dad arrived to pick him up, a look of sorrow on his face. The next few days were a blur. Eric took a leave of absence from the hospital, something he never imagined he would do. He had been mentally and emotionally shattered. For someone who had always been in control of his life, this was something he didn't know how to handle. He started therapy, urged by his father and friends. At first, he didn't want to go. How could talking to a stranger possibly heal the deep wounds that had been carved into his heart? But as the sessions went on, Eric began to slowly unravel the tangled mess of emotions within him. "I just don't understand how someone I loved so much could do this to me," he said during one of the sessions, his voice shaking. "I gave her everything, and this is how she repays me, with betrayal, with lies." His therapist sat across from him, calm and composed. "You're going through one of the hardest experiences a person can face, Eric. The pain you're feeling is valid, but you need to let yourself process it, not bury it." But how could he process it? Every time he thought about Samantha, about what she had done, a wave of anger and sadness would crash over him. He wanted revenge, wanted her to feel the same agony she had inflicted on him. But revenge, he knew deep down, wouldn't heal him. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Eric began to piece his life back together. The scars were still there, raw and painful, but he was learning to live with them. Therapy helped, as did the support of his family, but the anger, the need for revenge, still simmered beneath the surface. Samantha had tried to contact him. She had sent messages, tried calling, even showed up at his father's house once. But Eric refused to see her. What could she possibly say to make things right? What excuse could she offer that would undo the pain? One evening, after weeks of silence, Samantha sent a letter. It was filled with apologies and explanations. She claimed she had been lonely, felt neglected with Eric always working, always at the hospital. She said she had made a mistake, one that she regretted deeply. Eric read the letter, his hands trembling with anger. Lonely, he had been working tirelessly to provide for their future, to build a life for them. And this was how she repaid him. For a moment, he considered burning the letter, letting the flames consume her hollow apologies. But then he paused. Revenge wouldn't heal him. What he needed was closure. And that wouldn't come from anger, it would come from letting go. The lesson was clear. Even the strongest people can be broken by betrayal, but it's how you rise from the ashes that defines you. Eric learned that healing wasn't about getting even or holding on to the pain. It was about moving forward. Even when it felt impossible, he would never be the same, but he would be stronger for it. In the end, Samantha's betrayal had shattered him, but it hadn't destroyed him. Eric was still standing, still moving forward, and that was the greatest revenge of all. Kelly sat at the edge of the bed, the coolness of the night air pressing against her skin through the thin curtains. The city outside buzzed with life, but inside, the silence was deafening. She glanced at the clock, 1:27 a.m. Simon wasn't home yet, and he hadn't bothered to text or call. The sinking feeling in her chest tightened. A familiar companion in the long, lonely nights she had become accustomed to. Simon, once her everything, now felt like a stranger. It wasn't always like this. When they first met, he was charming, attentive, and so full of life. Kelly remembered their whirlwind romance, the nights spent laughing until their stomachs hurt, the promises of forever whispered in the dark. But those days seemed like a distant memory, replaced by cold indifference and a growing sense of dread. It had started subtly missed dinners, vague excuses, and an unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes. Kelly had tried to ignore the signs, telling herself she was being paranoid, but deep down, she knew. Simon was slipping away from her, lost in a world she was no longer a part of. The first time she confronted him, he brushed it off with a laugh. "You're imagining things, Kelly. Work has just been stressful." But she knew better. The late nights, the sudden interest in his appearance, and the way his phone was always glued to his hand, the screen quickly turned away whenever she was near. He was hiding something, and it was tearing her apart. One evening, Kelly's suspicions were confirmed. Simon had told her he was going out with friends, casual night out, nothing more. But as she sat alone in their apartment, her mind wouldn't rest. Something gnawed at her, urging her to check. She hesitated, hating herself for the mistrust, but her hands moved on their own, dialing the number of one of Simon's closest friends. "Hey, is Simon with you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. A pause. No, Kelly, I haven't seen him tonight." The world seemed to tilt, her worst fears coming to life. She hung up, her heart pounding. Hours later, Simon stumbled in, the faint scent of someone else's perfume lingering on his clothes. Kelly confronted him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you weren't with your friends." Simon's reaction was explosive. "Pack your bags and go back to your parents," he shouted, his face twisted in anger. You have no right to ask me where I am or who I'm meeting with. Kelly recoiled as if struck. The words cut deeper than any knife, leaving her gasping for air. She had always been the one to make sacrifices, to go above and beyond for him. She managed the house, worked her jobs, paid her own bills, and cared for his children from his previous marriage as if they were her own. She loved them, nurtured them, and never once asked for anything in return. But now, it felt like her entire world was crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. The days that followed were a blur of numbness and pain. Simon withdrew even further, barely acknowledging her presence unless he wanted something. And when he did speak, it was to demand or criticize. Yet, despite the heartbreak, Kelly found herself trying even harder to win him back. She cooked his favorite meals, cleaned the house until it sparkled, and gave in to his every desire in the bedroom, hoping against hope that he would see her, love her again. But Simon remained distant, his heart seemingly locked away from her. She saw the messages on his phone, the flirtatious exchanges with women whose names she didn't recognize. She knew he was meeting them, spending time with them in ways he no longer did with her. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to leave. The thought of walking away from the life they had built, the children she had grown to love, was too much to bear. One evening, as Kelly folded Simon's clothes, she found a note tucked into the pocket of his jacket. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, the neat handwriting jumping off the page. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Kelly's world shattered. The pieces of her broken heart seemed to scatter across the floor, each one cutting deeper into her soul. She sank to the ground, the note clutched in her hand, sobs racking her body. How had it come to this? What had she done to deserve this betrayal? But as the tears flowed, something inside her began to shift. A quiet resolve took root, growing stronger with each passing moment. She couldn't keep living like this, constantly fighting for scraps of affection from a man who no longer cared. Simon had made his choice, and it was time for her to make hers. That night, as Simon slept beside her, Kelly made a decision. She would confront him one last time, but not as the broken woman he had tried to reduce her to. She would do it as the strong, capable person she had forgotten she was. The next morning, Kelly stood in the kitchen, her hands steady as she prepared Simon's coffee. He sauntered in, barely glancing at her as he checked his phone. She watched him, the man she had once loved more than anything, and felt nothing but a deep, aching sadness. "Simon, we need to talk," she said, her voice calm. He looked up, annoyance flickering in his eyes. "What now?" "I found this." She placed the note on the table, watching his reaction carefully. Simon's face paled, but he quickly recovered, a sneer curling his lips. "So what? What are you going to do about it?" Kelly took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm done, Simon. I'm done trying to fix something you've already given up on. I've given you everything, and all you've done is take. But no more. I deserve better than this." For the first time in months, Simon looked uncertain. "You're leaving?" Kelly nodded, a small, sad smile on her lips. "Yes, I am. I'm going back to my parents, just like you told me to. But this time, it's my choice. I won't let you keep hurting me." Simon opened his mouth to say something, but Kelly held up her hand. "Don't. There's nothing left to say." She turned and walked away, her heart heavy but resolute. She packed her bags, carefully folding the life she had known into neat little piles. As she placed the last item in her suitcase, she paused, looking around the room one final time. This had been her home, her sanctuary, but now it was just a place filled with memories of pain and betrayal. With a deep breath, Kelly zipped up her suitcase and walked out the door, not looking back. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead would be difficult, but she knew she would find her way. She had to for herself, for the person she had once been, and for the person she was becoming. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the weight on her chest began to lift. For the first time in a long time, Kelly felt a glimmer of hope. She was free, and she would heal. One day, she would look back on this chapter of her life and see it for what it was: a lesson in strength, in knowing her worth, and in never settling for less than she deserved. And with that, Kelly walked forward into her new life, leaving the shattered reflections of her past behind.